Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Soulful Revolution, a podcast at the intersection of spiritual transformation and social change. I'm your host, Lauren Grubaugh Thomas, a priest, writer, spouse, and twin mama living in Colorado on the homelands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples. Every episode, I feature a conversation with a soulful revolutionary, a person whose commitment to justice is nourished by their spiritual beliefs, values, and praxis, and whose approach to spirituality is clarified through their courageous engagement in the world. My guest today is Adriana DiFazio. Adriana is a Buddhist practitioner scholar, meditation mentor, facilitator, and parent. She writes about Western Buddhism, social change, ethics, and culture through her newsletter, Radical Change, on Substack. Adriana, it is a joy to have you on the show today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for having me. I'm so excited.
Me too. I want to begin by asking you what it means to inhabit this intersection of spiritual transformation and social change.
Yeah. So for me, in my own Buddhist practice, when I initially started, I wasn't so interested necessarily in other people, to be quite honest. I came to the Dharma from my own suffering. I was a college student at the time and was really honestly just desperate for some type of practice, training, worldview that would help alleviate my own suffering. And so I picked up a book about Buddhism and meditation from the self-help and spirituality section of a Barnes& and Noble.
Mm.
I was like literally kneeling, kneeling at the shelves trying to
Wow.
find something. Um, and I picked up a book and read it in my dorm room, and it changed my life. I mean, it was
Mm.
like one of those experiences where you're reading a text and you feel like you've read it in a previous lifetime. And I started reading more Dharma books first because I was honestly a little too scared to actually do meditation practice. I had a lot of
Mm.
aversion to sitting with myself, but then eventually cultivated some sense of courage to do so. And yeah, I fell in love. I fell in love with the Dharma in the ways that it helped me
Mm.
alleviate my own suffering, but then allowed me to cultivate the courage to help and try to alleviate other people's suffering too. And
Mm.
so my path in terms of any type of spiritual activism happened, I think it was a natural unfolding in some respect. Uh, Once my own suffering, the edge, had been alleviated to some respect, um, it felt like a natural extension. I mean, the Buddhist teachings on compassion and no self, interdependence, it seemed like this idea of, that my suffering was separate from other people's wasn't necessarily a thing for me anymore. And so,
Mm.
yeah, it's been a progression over the years now as to, what spiritual activism means to me. I think my politics have gotten radicalized in the process too. And so it's been interesting for me to reconcile what that means in terms of my own understanding and practice of the Dharma.
For our listeners who may not know, what is the Dharma?
Yeah, so when I say the Dharma, I'm referencing the Buddhist teachings. So, yeah, or Buddhism.
And I'm curious to hear more about your specific stream. And in your writing, I hear you talk about engaged Buddhism. And I'm curious about what that looks like for you, as I know there's many different streams of Buddhist tradition and teaching.
Yeah, so socially engaged Buddhism as a term was really coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese
Mm.
Zen master in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. But socially engaged Buddhism as a strain of Buddhist practice and movement actually originated within Asian liberation movements in Sri Lanka, across
Wow.
the Asian continent. And so socially engaged Buddhism, as we understand it now in the West, um, looks like a bunch of different things. I mean, there's, hallmark organizations that we associate with socially engaged Buddhism now, and certain teachers like Roshi Joanne Halifax or Buddhist Peace Fellowship. Um, but I really understand socially engaged Buddhism and radically engaged Buddhism as a non-sectarian movement of Buddhist practitioners and meditators that see the very clear connection between our own individual suffering and the suffering of others, and are trying
Mm.
to have Buddhist practice and teachings and not only inform one's own resiliency to organize and be involved in some form of activism, but also have an analysis of how suffering is reproduced. Uh,
Mm.
so engaged Buddhism, yeah, for me now is I'm the big inspiration, honestly, for radical change in this newsletter that I started is uh, socially engaged Buddhism has been quite disparate across Western Buddhism, and a lot of prominent teachers or faces of socially engaged Buddhism uh, are a generation that are currently in their 60s and 70s. And I feel
Mhm.
like there's a space right now in which the formation of socially engaged Buddhists, millennials, or even Gen Z, uh, Gen X as well. We're living in a very specific time, and so that iteration of what it really means to be an engaged Buddhist now, I think we're in the process of translating.
Handing down the torch, as it were, passing on the torch. I
Yeah,
I find myself really curious about that generational shift, as a community organizer and faith leader, because I find within the Christian tradition and within my own Episcopal tradition in particular, that there is a disconnect in terms of the language that is used, in terms of understanding just the embodied experiences of suffering, to borrow your language, that millennials and the younger generations have been experiencing, from the 2008 economic meltdown to gun violence in schools to the genocide in Palestine, and seeing all of, especially our generation and the younger generation, seeing it play out in real time on our phones for the last 15 months. And that there's a gap between some of the lived experiences generationally. And so I hear in what you're saying this longing to be able to communicate these teachings to folks in ways that can be received. And I'm really curious, for you, what are some of the things that really met you where you are in terms of your particular experiences of suffering? You alluded to feeling like the edge had been taken off of your suffering in some ways through your practice. Yeah, how did socially engaged Buddhism meet you in your own suffering, and maybe in some of the particularities of suffering that maybe not unique to our generation, but are felt in particularly acute ways or in unique ways.
yeah. Yeah, and in early college, it was the suffering I was experiencing at the time was very specific. I mean, on one part of the spectrum, I was experiencing my first real heartbreak from a
Mm,
relationship, but I also
sure.
think I was moving through a really intense period of disillusionment of,
Mm,
I throughout my life, I'd always been like the quote unquote good girl, overachiever, um, worked really hard to get good grades, to get into a good college. And then I think my first 2 years of university, I was like, "What is this all for?" I
mm,
was like, "Our world is on fire. Everyone's just climbing the corporate ladder, trying to get banking or consulting jobs to make six figures at 23 years old." And I just felt like there was such a disconnect. I think it was like the beginning of my radicalization process in some
mhm,
ways, and yeah, I think Buddhism offered me this worldview that helped me understand the root of my own suffering and the way that it manifests in other people. And so I didn't
mm,
personalize suffering so much, like the clingy, graspy aspects of um, my when I did experience anxiety or irritation. It wasn't so much like, oh, I am anxiety or I am
mm,
irritation. This isn't necessarily who I am in this moment. And I felt that was a really important lesson for me as a 19-year-old at the time. Um,
mm,
but even though Buddhism was really helpful for me in college when alleviating suffering, I mean, I'm now 31 years old, and I think about how the Dharma has met me through punctuated periods of the past decade of my life and helped me or wasn't able to help me, or I had to take more time. And I think particularly becoming a mother, becoming a parent, I mean, wow, I don't know about you, but I I obviously knew that, becoming a parent was going to be life-changing and shifting, but I don't think I was really prepared, to be quite honest, for
Yeah.
the suffering.
Nothing prepares you. Yeah, the suffering, it is. It is. I don't think there's anything that prepares you for the suffering of
Yeah.
parenthood.
Yeah, like, even last my son, he was up last night from 5 AM to 7
Oh gosh.
and I was and it's like, we've been here before. This is not a new thing, but I was, like, sitting with myself and my irritation and my impatience. I was like, "Wow, like, I still have so much to learn. The
Yes.
Dharma has so much to teach me still."
Mm,
Yeah,
mm.
I'm curious for you too, with becoming a mother, especially to twins. I mean, that's a whole nother level of parenting. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, they
how your faith has supported you and your practices
mm,
and that transition of your life.
mm. I resonate with the way in which children are teachers, and that there's a rich landscape for teaching as a parent constantly. My my core spirituality is nonviolence, that really guides both my spiritual practice and my political praxis, the way that I think about engaging in the world. And I don't know if there's a better way to practice nonviolence than having children. Like, just especially toddlers. And I just love that we have, kids the same age going through the same, ups and downs, I'm sure. I did not know how much my patience would be tested and my irritability would be aroused by having these adorable humans sharing my home. Um, and it's different than I think a lot of people talk about babyhood being really difficult. And that was in its own way just physically so exhausting and demanding. And I felt like I lost myself for a season. I read recently that you don't get your like hormones restored postpartum for 2 years. Like the levels are all out of whack for 2 full years. So that clarified a lot. But yeah, I have found toddlerhood to be so trying because the moments where I just out of sheer frustration and feeling helpless, where I want to like act out, and I want to act out violently. Like that's the honest truth. That there are so many moments where I just am like at my wit's end, and I just, if I didn't have some really strong values and ethics around violence and around nonviolence, like that I maybe would act out. And if I hadn't been raised in a household where my parents were really intentional about not using violence as discipline. Um, but it's hard. The self-control is really a daily practice. And it feels like it starts all, as you were kind of describing with your son, it starts all over again every single day. Like, oh, I think I've gotten better and I'm growing. And then the next day there's some new frustration. And it's all like situated within them being so cute and so curious and so full of wonder and joy and creativity. And so it just kind of catches me off guard sometimes how I can be so enjoying them in one moment and then just absolutely triggered in the
Oh,
next moment.
completely.
Yeah.
I feel like 80% of parenting is regulating yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's, like, so
Totally.
much online about, like, mindful parenting or like, being a mindful mama, especially in, the spaces I'm in because of Buddhism, and I'm like, "Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, I'm, like, the least mindful mama. I don't even know what's going on." I'm, like, trying to survive over here.
It feels so aspirational sometimes. Yeah. What grounds you when you're having those inevitable moments with your with your son where you're feeling frustrated where you're feeling overwhelmed? What tools do you draw upon? What do you find grounding and rooting and clarifying?
Yeah, it's
Asking for a friend.
no, do you know what
Right?
do you know what's interesting about that? Because I feel like this has just been a recent insight for myself, especially
Mm,
having recently returned back to work after being home with my son for 9 months is, um, now, I have childcare, but I'm, like, negotiating hours quite specifically to do my work, and I work from home, and other than being at daycare, my son's usually home too, when afterwards, and when I'm not respecting, like, my own sense of, my own practice, like, when
Mm.
I'm not connected to my, own meditation practice or the teachings, it's very, very easy for me to essentially, I find my son more annoying
Yeah.
in those instances. Um, I'm, like, unable to really, I mean, it seems so basic, but I'm really unable to be present for him when he's, screaming mama down the hallway for the 10 millionth time. Um, and I find that, like, a lot of it for me shows up as aggression, like, a
Mm.
lot of it comes off as, like, a speediness for me, so I'm like, "Well, I need to
Mhm.
get this done," like, and I end up viewing my s it's terrible, I mean, it's like, this is terrible to say, but then I
Oh,
end up,
it's
like,
so
I
normal. Yeah.
I end up viewing my son as, like, this obstacle to, like, this work that I
Sure.
find really meaningful, and so I don't wanna feel that way, I mean, it's, like, so sticky and yeah, sticky, to feel that
Mm.
way about your own child, but it's always a reminder to me where I'm like, "Okay, Adriana, like, what this isn't really about him. This is you needing to have stronger discernment in terms of your own integrity of your practice, and
Mm.
your connection to it, because the work will be there. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but if you're not connected to your spiritual practice and your own values and worldview and integrity that talk about, especially as someone in some type of, like, spiritual leadership or teaching position, I mean, what's the point, but
You mentioned discernment, and you wrote a piece about this just recently, about the power of discernment and movement, and I think you invoke your son too in that piece, and I love the way you define discernment. You said, "Discernment is the quality that allows us to see beyond our cravings and distractions." And so I'm curious to hear more from you about discernment when it comes to parenting. What does it look like to discern the way that you relate to your son and the way that you reconnect with your practice and the teaching? Mm.
yeah. So discernment is one of my favorite teachings out of Tibetan Buddhism. So the word for discernment in Tibetan is payu. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, to be honest. It's Payu, and um, it's in that piece I wrote about it in respect to the discernment that you apply when you're engaging in some type of meditation technique. Um, but it's traditionally taught in regards to, like, the discernment that we have regarding ethical actions,
Mm.
in relationship to the Buddhist teachings on karma. And for me, ultimately, this idea of discernment is really a reminder of our own agency. Um,
Mm.
but not just any type of agency, it's like the agency that comes from the confidence in your own Buddha nature, like your own
Mm.
basic goodness. Um,
Mm.
in Buddhist practice, or often a huge part of practice is not necessarily to view the Buddha as, like, this mythical creature that is completely separate from our own human experience, but actually to recognize that he was a human just like you and me,
Mm.
and his ability to wake up to see the nature of reality is not something that is far off or so impossible, but that we can wake up.
Mm.
We actually have the possibility of waking up within this lifetime. Um,
Mm.
and so for me, when I'm with my son now, I'm conscious of the volitional energy regard behind my choices of how I choose to actually interact with him. And
Mm.
you know, my husband and I have made very intentional decisions regarding parenting with him, and a lot of our friends and family thought we were, like, absolutely insane. I had a home birth, like, we did all of the crunchy
Mm.
granola things. He's co-slept with us for a very long
Oh.
time. It was never because I, like, necessarily did a bunch of research. It was just my following a sense of intuition for
Mm.
myself, and also, quite frankly, convenience while breastfeeding. But,
Mm.
um, think there's a sense for me where I mean secular terms we talk about habit energy. In Buddhist terms, we would call that our karmic volitional energy. And
Mm,
so we know doing things attributes to good habits, but then putting in a spiritual worldview has always been really supportive for me,
mm.
because it doesn't feel like some rote, psychology advice. It's like, oh no, 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 this is integrated into the fabric of like how contemplation, formal meditation practice and study, and then ethical precepts actually integrate and work together.
I hear so much integration, like the ways in which you're daily seeking to bring your spirituality and your way of being in the world into sync. Um, and I'm always curious with Buddhism, which is so praxis based, which is so embodied in terms of meditation and the mind body connection. Um, just to hear more about like what your practice looks like just really walking us through, for people who may not have a meditation practice in particular, and like where that may be, new for a lot of listeners, or at least the depth of it may be something that they've not experienced. Like what your meditation practice entails, and how are you drawing, together through your meditation practice the spiritual and the temporal, the physical world that you're navigating every day with your family, with your work. Yeah, like where does the rubber meet the road for you in terms of your practice?
In the morning, I chant a series of
Hmm.
chants, lineage chants, um, and primarily, and then end up sitting and practicing shamatha, which is a calm abiding meditation practice. What we
Hmm.
commonly would perceive as mindfulness meditation. Um, and then maybe on certain days would practice something called three refuges practice, where you
Hmm.
contemplate the three jewels, which are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the community of practitioners. The three jewels are the things that you take vows in when you formally, quote unquote, become a Buddhist. Um, but then it also includes, for me as a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, sadhana practices, which sadhana is a
Hmm.
Sanskrit word which translates to great works. And they seem like, honestly, if you read it, like a stream of consciousness from from
Hmm.
uh, it was from a Tibetan teacher, but um, yeah, I've found, I guess it would mirror similarly in the Christian tradition prayer, that chanting, verbalizing, is really quite powerful for me because it helps me reassert my view. Like
Hmm.
just falling into my meditation practice or seat. Um, you can meditate, of course, but having some type of chanting or text to remind you as like why you're even sitting to begin with, what's your aspiration, what's your intention, I've always found to be really supportive. And then evening practices also incorporate something called protector chants. Um,
Hmm.
protector chants in Tibetan Buddhism are what they sound like. You're chanting, what you're protecting yourself from is really the three poisons: greed, aggression, and delusion. And
Hmm.
I don't know, honestly, the history of it exactly, but it makes sense because I feel like in the evening, it's like I just want to watch Netflix and like just totally be mindless. But protector chants uh, help us like re-establish our view again, perhaps maybe like during the most vulnerable
Hmm.
time of our day.
Yeah,
um,
when our guard is down.
Yeah. But beyond that, I mean, the precepts are huge for me. I'm love Buddhist precepts. I mean, they are
Hmm.
they're an aspect that a lot of Western Buddhist practitioners that come to the Dharma through secular mindfulness meditation, don't necessarily engage with from the very beginning. And
Hmm.
um, the precepts are behavioral guidelines, similar to not they would mirror something like the Ten Commandments, but they're means of mental trainings as well, and so they're not behavioral absolutes of not doing X, Y, and Z, but more so, um, a way to really examine your own contradictions, uh, look
Mm.
at the ways in which you are, uh, living into your actual values, and so the precepts have been very big for me in terms of, yeah, my day to day, because even on days in which I don't necessarily get the chance to sit down and meditate, um, the the precepts are just
Mhm.
constant reminders of enlightened activity. There's
Hmm.
so yeah, that's a little bit of what my actual spiritual practice looks like.
Oh, that's so lovely. Some of those are totally new to me, the precepts and the protection chants. Those are really lovely. With protection, I was reminded of when you're talking about, wanting to watch Netflix at the end of the day, that one of the practices that's been really important to me and we've adapted with our children is called the daily examine.
Mhm.
And it comes from the Jesuit tradition, this which is a stream of the Catholic tradition, where you are reviewing your day and looking at where were the places of consolation, where were the moments of desolation. And moments of consolation are where you experience the divine, where there was a sense of the presence of God. And the moments of desolation are moments that were experienced as the absence of God, and then holding those together in your spirit and in being attentive to what that experience was like. And so that, just in a very organic way, we sort of stumbled into doing this with our kids, where my husband one day asked our daughters, what made you happy today? And then what made you sad today? And the girls, when they were starting about 2, they were able to start piping in and saying, and most days it's their teacher. It's their teacher or it's mommy or daddy, and now they're starting to add, like, some friends to the mix. And they started asking us within a couple of months of doing this, or even weeks, like, they wanted to know what ours was, and so they will just say, "Mommy, what's your happy? Daddy, what's your happy?" And if one of us isn't in the room, they won't let us off the hook, the parent who is in the room. They need to know what the parent's happy was
Hmm.
who's not in the room, and so they'll be like, "Call daddy, ask daddy, what was his happy?" Um, and so I've been pondering this, and I'm so curious with your son what you might be seeing, because it's been so clear to me how much my children crave ritual and practice. And when we don't do it, or we're about to move past it in our rush to be efficient and to get on with bedtime, they don't let us.
Yeah.
It's this, "Mommy, what's your happy?" And so I'm curious with your son, are there ways, as he's now just turned 3, right? Um, are there ways in which you're seeing him notice your practices, or that he's bringing his own practices into your household?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear from you more about how you and your partner are, like, thinking about spiritual formation for your children, because I think that's something
Mm.
I'm really wrestling with. Um, Again, I'm, like, again, jealous of my Christian peers because I feel like there's so much structure for that, and, um,
Mm.
I've brought my son on a meditation retreat before through,
Oh.
through Plum Village, not through their tradition at Blue Cliff in upstate New York, and it was so funny. Well, first of all, I, like, could barely meditate because he was just, he was just crawling all over the meditation hall, and I was, like, so worried about him making noise and disturbing people. But, but what was so interesting about that experience is that we took all our meals in silence with the monastics, and, families are with the nuns there, and you eat in silence for the first, like, 20 minutes of your meal, and I was really worried about how he would do with that. I mean, he was, like, 2
Mhm.
years old at the time. I was like, "Oh gosh,
Yeah.
was this a bad idea bringing him here?" And, um, he just I was amazed how, like, the energy of the environment
Mm.
actually shaped his behavior. He sat on my lap and ate his food in complete silence for 20 minutes, while the
Wow.
nuns in front of him were, like, making funny faces.
No. You just soaked it in.
Yeah, and I was amazed. I was like, "What's happening here? He's never been this quiet." for 20 minutes in a row.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, in terms of my own practice at home, it's interesting. I do think this is something that's hard about something I've always struggled honestly with Buddhist practice is that uh in many ways it's like not very conducive for family life. Like
Mm,
like formal practice. I mean, there's a reason why um folks become monastics and don't have children, and yeah, and serious study and practice, but, um, yeah, for a long time, I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna, like, sit, and my son will just, like, crawl all over me," but I would always end up just more, like, frustrated, honestly,
mhm,
by the ends of the practice period, and, um yeah, so it's hard. It's something that, like, I think I'm still struggling with because, like, I'm like, "Oh, do I bring him on retreats again?" And then me and my husband just, like, try to figure out how to be be with him, but, um, the one the one thing that is, coming to mind just, like, regarding his own rituals, we've read a book about Lunar New Year every single night for the past
mm,
month,
hmm.
and he we have to finish we have to finish the book on Lunar New Year, right? I'm like, "3 books tonight, Bo," and he's like, "Okay, 3 books," and then we get to the 3rd book, I'm like, "Okay, we turn off the lights now." He's like, Lunar New Year, Lunar New Year."
Yes.
Yeah, so
They fixate and have, yeah, their habits that they
I
have.
have
It's
to
such a
have
comfort.
yeah,
Mm,
so I think a lot about, like, spiritual education. I mean, I grew up going to CCD, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and so
mm,
Um, I went to church every Sunday. Like
mm,
our family was very involved with our parish. I was in church choir. My brother and sister were lectors, and even though I don't practice within that tradition in the same way anymore, it was so spiritually formative for me. I mean,
mm,
my values that I still have now as an adult are because of my parents raising me and my
mm,
siblings in the Catholic Church, and so um, yeah, I really worry. My husband's Jewish, and so,
mhm.
when there's, like, 2 parents of different faith traditions, and then the child has, like, no faith that they grow up with, yeah, something that I'm wrestling with now. Yeah.
Mm. I wonder as Bo gets older, how discernment might become part of his journey as a child in a interfaith family. I just think there's so much beauty in being able to have, I don't know, this rich banquet of practices and traditions that you grow up with, and then being able to discern and choose what really resonates with your spirit. I think that's, I hear you with the challenge of that. I think that doing that, I'm sure, is really a unique challenge, but my goodness, what a gift for him to be able to have such a beautiful array of rituals and traditions and wisdom to draw from.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean,
Mm,
I hope so. I hope that he feels a sense of, connection to one of the spiritual traditions of his upbringing. It doesn't necessarily have to be
mm.
Buddhist by any means, and, um yeah, it's funny. We went to, like, a UU, church for a while because I was like, "Oh, like, there's everything here. Maybe this is
Sure.
where we could find a home." Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting because discernment is actually a term like, this idea of discerning is a term that I really didn't come across a lot until I went to seminary because
Mm,
it was, like, a term that was used a lot by like, my Christian peers,
mhm.
regarding discerning their vocational call, and,
Right.
um, yeah, I'm curious I have my very specific understanding of discernment from Buddhism, but I'm curious what your understanding is of discernment in regards to your
Mm,
own tradition.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, that, I think that's probably where I first encountered discernment, was in the framing around vocation, being able to have to be able to be present to what one's gifts and aptitudes are, to be able to be present to the voice of God, as would be put in the Christian tradition, is this idea of if one is listening, that there is this divine presence that has something to say to every person. And so that was something that I really embraced in my own journey toward becoming an Episcopal priest. But when I look back on my life, that was, even if I didn't have the language for it, that I think it was the practice that I was raised in. My mom is a therapist and my dad is a journalist. And so asking questions was really key to my childhood and the way that our family ran. We just spent a lot of time in conversation and asking questions and wrestling with the big picture around spirituality, around politics. I mean, nothing was really off limits in our at our dinner table. And so I think the questioning was always a part of my sense of spirituality, and that as I deepened my own religious practice, that came to understand that as discernment, both the bringing my questions, my wonderings about the world and my relationship to the world, my relationship to God, into space of contemplation, space of silence, space where I can be with those questions in really deep ways that might be sometimes really scary and vulnerable, which often has involved for me being in spaces of silence. And so when you're talking about, being with the monastics and having silent meals together, like I'm so grateful that there are monks, there are especially I owe so much to the Sisters of the Transfiguration outside of Cincinnati, which is an Episcopal community of women living in study and in prayer and in community, for holding that space, for silence and for contemplation and for discernment. But now when I think about discernment, it's like so much broader than just this vocational discernment that I kind of initially was introduced to, which is, I think a lot about discernment as the way in which I am teasing out what is mine and what is not in terms of the work that I'm being called to, that I'm being drawn toward. So almost like, I don't know, all the different threads that are tied up together in a bundle, and being able to like parse out and tease out one and say, oh, this is the one, this is mine, based on time spent in deep thought and curiosity and courageous curiosity. And part of the work that I'm doing now is around helping other folks, accompanying other folks as they're discerning what is theirs and what's not, and specifically like discerning their divestment from systems of oppression and violence, and being able to ask the hard questions courageously, which there's not many spaces to be able to do that, without being shamed or just having the space for curiosity at all. Like there's not a lot of spaciousness in our culture. So that's where I guess that's the place in which I experience discernment, is in these spaces where I can ponder and I can ask questions and I can just be quiet, and listen.
Yeah. Yeah, this idea of what's ours to do or not, I really, I mean, I resonate with that specifically because I feel like becoming a mother has really
Mm,
forced me to really sharpen my sense of discernment. I mean, before I became a parent, I feel like I was a generalist that did everything, like like always volunteer, like raise my hand for things, and very quickly realized that was like not possible anymore. But even
yeah.
now, in terms of my work and writing and teaching and regarding Buddhism, I'm like, okay, I have to be like very focused as to like what it is exactly that I want to translate of the Dharma.
Mm,
Um, which I think it ultimately is a good thing, of course. Um, but yeah, I don't know if you struggle with that as well. I had like a little bit of an existential identity crisis, I think, when I became a mother in regards to my own
mm,
activism and organizing, because I just like didn't
mhm.
have that disposable time, like
Yeah.
for unpaid labor, to be quite frank, in the ways
Yeah.
that I used to before I had a child. Um, yeah, and then being able to, yeah, figure out what that really means in terms of one's own engagement with the world beyond their work. I mean, of course, one's work could be their own form of activism too, but yeah, did you wrestle with that at all?
Oh goodness, yes.
Okay.
And still do. Still do. I think the biggest piece being like wondering about embodiment. Like because I do so much from behind the screen. And whether it's my writing or teaching, there's so much that happens digitally. And I there's definitely moments where I felt really guilty about I get an invitation to go to a protest and I'm like, sorry, I don't have a babysitter and I can't, especially with twins. If I had one kid, maybe I would strap them on and go, wear the baby wear them. But that's just not really been available to me with having twins. And even with the privilege that I have had of being able to have our girls be in they're in a wonderful Montessori preschool. Time is so precious and limited when it's time for myself. And so again, discerning, right? I have to be so discerning about where energy is spent, um, primarily because I want to be able to show up with patience and affection and care for my children. And so I think one of the big shifts for me has been around prioritizing my children as one of the primary ways, if not the primary way, in which I am pouring love into the world.
Yeah.
And it can feel so small. And like you were describing earlier, when I'm not rooted in my own practices, um, then I can really struggle with seeing them as that channel and that your opportunity to be able to be like this is the work as opposed to you're keeping me from the work that I'd like to be doing. You're a
Yeah.
distraction,
Yeah.
um, which is heartbreaking when I can step back and see that that's what I'm doing. Heartbreaking, and also then there's the invitation for me always of like grace, like having grace for myself, because this is the ongoing work of becoming who I am, and of discerning what the work is. But goodness, it just feels like such a daily practice to do that as a parent, as a mom. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had no appreciation. I'm curious if this is your experience. I really didn't realize how everything gets reprioritized as a parent. And
Oh.
I would look at parents and just be like, well, why don't you come to this thing at 8 o'clock at night? It's once a week.
Yeah.
Like, why why is that so difficult?
No,
Yeah.
I mean, it's been completely humbling.
Yeah.
I think it's helped me become more compassionate, to be honest, as an activist
Yeah. Yeah.
and organizer. I mean, I think it makes me recognize why a lot of a lot of organizing is not intergenerational. Like there's like this like gap of
Mhm.
people within like experiencing early parenthood that like aren't able to necessarily engage in the ways that they used to. And it's actually something I've been thinking about and contemplating a lot of like what does it really mean to include I mean, I had to, like, constantly remind myself that parents and children are actually part of, like, what we perceive as the vulnerable group,
Yeah.
and it was really hard for me at the time to accept that. It's like, "Oh, yes, like, Adriana, what are you talking about? Like, you're this is you actually aren't completely resourced right now because you have to, like, pay
Mhm.
someone money to even do any the things that you used to do,
Yeah.
with a lot more ease." And yeah, I it makes me just, like, wonder what it means to, include to find ways in which parents and their children could be involved in organizing beyond
Mm.
I don't know. Do you get what I'm trying to say? Like, when I think of, like, actually building movements, it's like, do parents just, like all parents just drop off for, like, 10 years and then come back? Or
Right.
or they try to do the type of work that we're both doing in terms of, like, the little bits that we can,
Mm.
through creative projects or other ways, and, unless it's your full-time social unless you do full-time social change work, and you're paid a
Right.
salary, and so, um, yeah, I think it's really hard. I don't think I know anyone that really is that Do you know anyone?
cracked it.
Yeah.
No. I think that's just it's just a good challenge for everybody, it seems. But it can feel really isolating. I mean, I definitely can get the mindset of, oh, it's just me and I should be doing more, all the shoulds. Um, I think I do take some consolation in the the interconnectedness of nonviolent movement, that we need everyone, and in different and that people can be in different seasons and bring different gifts. And I I have found a lot of consolation and hope in coming out of this Western American individualism, um, to be able to embrace this spirituality and praxis that's very much about the collective,
Mhm.
that we need each other, and that we don't have to be all things to all people, and we can't be. Um, and I think it's what really gives me pause when I hear folks talking about, violent revolution as though it's the only solution, like that we're at our we've reached our limits of what nonviolence can do. And I hear a lot of despair and lack of creativity in it, and it mostly because I need nonviolent movement at this point in my life in order to be involved.
Yeah,
Like I
completely.
can't be putting myself in. There's risks I'm willing to take, and there's calculated risks, and then there's risks that, like, at this point in my life I can't. And nonviolent movement affords the space for me to be able to be involved in different ways than would be possible, if we were in just all out violent revolution. Like, I've heard it described as the participation advantage that when there's that a nonviolent movement has over violent movements, is that you need the babysitters and you need the people making meals, and you need the people who are flying flags out their windows while the baby's taking a nap. That there's a place for everybody. And I am so curious, as you've invited me to ponder. I'm so curious about the role for children, in movement, and how that could be empowered, and encouraged, because I have found so much hope seeing the ways that kiddos over the last 15 months of genocide, seeing the way that kids in the US have been involved in movement, whether they're making videos about Palestine, or they're going to protests with their parents where they're making art. Like, I remember seeing all the kites that were being made, as a way to honor Rafat Al-Arir and his poem "If I Must Die," that ends with a kite. And so kiddos making beautiful art, and that being such a sustaining and nourishing thing to see, that kids are able to bring their creativity and their love and because their hearts are breaking too. Um, and so that makes me feel really encouraged and hopeful. And I want to see more of that. I want to see
Mhm.
more spaces where kids and parents of young children are really welcome and embraced and seen as value added, and not as, oh, you'll get back involved when your kids turn 10.
Yeah.
I genuinely find myself curious about, like, how to create those spaces for people now, and how to be part of kinds of um, those kinds of actions and communities now. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's huge. I think it's like a huge, missed opportunity, honestly, for social change
Hmm.
movements of any capacity because, yeah, I mean, it's ironic, of course, because most, our movements are focused on the oppressed, and it's like and the vulnerable, and it's like, "Oh, wait, children and parents are part of that group in some capacity," and so, um
Yeah.
yeah, I also think children, particularly in protests and public demonstrations, also have a protective quality, add a protective
Hmm.
quality to it in terms of possible violence from the state. And I mean, by no means I'm necessarily saying that we should all be bringing our infants into into a protest in which there's police presence and there might be some sense of agitation, but um, you know in instances where I have seen parents bring, like, their toddlers to protests, I'm like, "Huh." Like, there's, like, an energy shift because everyone feels a sense of, like, protection of them, like, a sense of, like, everyone's their parent almost in those types of situations, and so, um, yeah, it's just curious. I'm just really curious about that, and I also really echo from you, like, the amount of things I was invited to this past year, and, I mean, witnessing a genocide as a parent and seeing the amount of children that have I mean, it's like a t especially with, like, being a first-time mother. I don't know what your experience was, but, I mean, I was really I mean, everyone obviously was distraught, but just felt like it was a very, yeah, like, the pain of that, is very difficult, and then to feel, like, somewhat helpless, honestly, in some ways of not being able to be engaged or involved in ways that I would have been before I became a mother was, very difficult for me. So it's like, I can't bring my highly sensitive toddler to a protest right after his nap time. He's gonna have a complete meltdown. Like, what is um, yeah, and I think that speaks to certain levels of our understanding of what activism really means in terms of
Mhm.
performance,
Mhm. Mhm.
like, if folks are not capable from whatever capacity, whether it be their children or from their own sense of, their own nervous system, like, their nervous system can't take showing up
Yeah.
to a huge event, what are other ways that they can help shift the needle in some capacity too?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, there's obviously tons of room and growth, I think.
Mm.
And I also worry that I'm gonna age out with my child, and then it won't really matter to me anymore. And then I'll forget.
Mm.
I
Mm.
don't know. I think so. I hope that's not the case, but
Yeah. Oh, it's so clearly rooted so deeply in your spirit, there's no uprooting that. Mm.
yeah,
Aging out, I mean, yeah, that's hard to imagine for you.
yeah,
But I do wonder about, like, maturation, how that, how those roots might deepen as children grow, how our commitments to justice and change might deepen and yeah, the maturity that can happen with time and experience. Um,
it's really nice to honestly talk about this with some another mother. I will say.
oh, well,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
appreciate that.
yeah.
It's very a very different experience, I think, than what it's like to not have kids. And there's it's just different. It's not good or bad, but um, it has given me a different lens to see suffering and experience. Oh my goodness, to just like you were describing with the genocide, like just the experience in my body. I have felt so many of these deaths in my womb. There's this deep injury and deep grief, like embodied feeling of emptiness that I have felt with so many mothers in Palestine. And that I know that won't go away, that is something that I will carry with me the rest of my life, especially when I encounter the suffering of children. I wonder for you, what that has been like in terms of your body and your spirit. Like, where do you find yourself carrying the grief of the world? Mm.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioning that your hormones don't regulate until 2 years after giving birth, I mean, that really
Mm.
resonates for me as well, and I think there's, a level that, of course, I couldn't have ever possibly known before bearing my own child and giving birth to them, and then
Mm.
healing from birth afterwards. The amount of energy and effort it takes to actually bring a life into this world, and
Mm.
then to take care of them at their most vulnerable. I mean, I felt this way very acutely, even just like in New York City when my son was an infant under the age of 6 months old, like getting on the subway and seeing houseless folks and just being like, oh my goodness, like someone tended to this human being or maybe not. I mean, to a certain extent, tended to this human being somewhat relentlessly for their first year of life in the way that
Yeah.
all human beings kind of need that attention. Um, and there was just something like inherently heartbreaking for me with that realization of it's like, oh my
Mm.
goodness, like so much energy and care was put into bringing this life into this world. And then we just discard them. I mean, you wrote about this,
Yeah.
Lauren. You had a post about
Mm.
this as well. And yeah, and just seeing that play out in terms of what was happening, what's been happening in Gaza, and just seeing how like life can just be extinguished so quickly. Obviously, always thought life is precious, but I think becoming a mother and recognizing like how precious it really is, um, yeah, has definitely changed things for me. But I think for a long time regarding just like my grief, and helplessness, honestly, like just being a stay-at-home mom and not necessarily having the time or resources to engage in activism and as I did beforehand, um, was really hard because I felt like my grief had nowhere to go because I usually translated my grief into action. And so not being able to do any form of organizing, not being able to write about it, um, was like debilitating, honestly.
Mhm. Mhm. I understand that. Yeah.
um, and so now I feel different because I think I've been able to exhaust some of that energy and karma just the past 4 months returning to work, but it just
Mm.
makes me just question and ask, what happens when we can't transmute our
Yeah.
grief and rage into action?
Hmm.
Like, what is available to us as people who care about the world? Like, what do you do with that? There's a part of me that thinks that perhaps processing our own grief through our spiritual practices or whatever the means may be has to simply just be enough for that time, for that
Yeah.
chapter of one's life, and to not, you know, end up placing any sense of guilt or shame onto that
Mm.
as well.
Yes, I resonate with that so deeply. The the sheer overwhelm and the feeling of even if I was doing everything in any 24-hour period that I could do, even if I was using all this time and all I was doing was purely acting on behalf of those who are suffering and being oppressed, that it would just be this inexhaustible flow inward of suffering. And it's just relentless. And as the world accelerates into climate catastrophe and into fascism and all these other forces that are causing so much harm, I think that for me, if I didn't have my spiritual practices, I would just be despairing of the state of the world. And I understand why so many people are experiencing suicidality and the rates of depression are so high because it is so completely overwhelming. And I'm reminded of Thomas Merton, who was a friend of Thich Nhat Hanh, who spoke of the frenzy of the activist being itself a form of violence.
Mm, mm,
And he was a Trappist monk who spent years living in almost total solitude with occasional times where he'd venture out and be in community or be doing teaching with people in person, but so much of his time was spent just alone and in silence and in contemplation. And I often return to that wisdom that is not really welcome wisdom. It's not wisdom I want to receive, because I am this very active person and I always have been. And that's like you were describing, that's always how I have been able to channel my rage, and which comes out of my grief over the state of the world. Um, but when I find myself exhausting all of my energies trying to attend to the suffering, in ways that are, I don't know, really embodied, I have to step back and I have to remember that, because I'll just deplete myself, in the process. And so yeah, and I think I find myself curious and I hear, you alluding to this, like this is what you just said about it needs that there are seasons of our life where that's going to be it and it needs to be enough. Um, and I wonder too if we're finding ourselves increasingly in a season where, for in so many ways, that is all we can do. That we can. I will always be acting. That is, there's no question of that. But if we don't have those spiritual practices to ground us and to be, I don't know, to bring our helplessness and despair somewhere, or to someone, depending on our understanding, that it's too much. It's just too much. And the words feel really paltry just to describe the experience, but it's certainly one that I feel in my bones. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that this the violence of the frenetic activeness. I mean
Mm-hmm.
that's quite real. And I think that's the reason why spirituality has such an incredible value and role in social activism, though.
Mm.
In Buddhism, speediness is viewed as a form of aggression as well.
Wow.
And so the type of speediness that accompanies busyness is
Mm.
also a form of aggression. And so I have to really check myself regarding that often too.
Hmm.
But I also think beyond the individual awareness, I mean, really need to create movements and where
Yeah.
f- we create a culture that it's acceptable and okay for that to
Mm.
happen to begin
Mm.
with.
Mm.
I think there's a really strong, I think, and dangerous tendency to weaponize shame in our social
Yeah.
movements to encourage people to act in some capacity. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really debilitating,
Yeah.
and spiritually and emotionally corrosive.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I think there's so much room for clergy and for spiritual traditions and teachers to adapt their teachings to make themselves relevant to our social movements. Yeah, I mean, it's the cliche, but it's like the way that our movements end up recreating the violence that we purport to
Totally.
challenge.
I wonder if you would share a bit about the Engaged Buddhism Book Club as a way to conclude and to invite folks into one way of doing that work in community.
Yeah, so the Engaged Dharma Book Club, I mean, it's been such a I had such low expectations, being honest, but it's been so fun.
Hmm.
I'm calling it the Engaged Dharma Book Club, but the vast majority of the books that we're reading actually have nothing to do with Buddhism. They're written by some incredible activists and organizers, and the intention behind it is to read these with other spiritually oriented folks, meditators, Buddhists, and process with the learnings that come from that from a spiritual or dharmic Buddhist worldview. Um, a lot of
Mm.
a lot of the intention for that was specifically the work that I used to do a lot of anti-racism spiritual work as well, and I
Mm.
recognize the quality of doing social justice work in spaces held by a spiritual worldview with spiritual practices just has like a different currency of energy in the room,
Mm.
and I find that
Mm.
much it's helpful for people to settle into their bodies and be able to have real conversations from a more embodied place. And
Yeah.
um, so we're reading 6 books over the course of the year. We just finished up our January book club. We'll have another one in March. They alternate every other month. The next book is The Next American Revolution, by the late Grace Lee Boggs. And then on the other alternating months, I am offering Engaged Buddhist Studies seminars as well. So anyone who's interested in
Wonderful.
the intersection of Buddhism and social change, uh, yeah, you can come like to the 1 hour workshop for that too. Yeah.
Amazing. I wonder if there's a word that you'd like to leave us with, a word of hope, a word of encouragement, for our listeners.
Oh, wow. My Buddhist name is it's in Tibetan. It's Sonju Nima, and
Mm.
Nima is the Tibetan word for sun. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the sun has a feminine quality um, in which it represents our own inherent wakeful nature. And the
Mm.
sun is always there, right? In the same way that the sun is always in the sky. It's just our spiritual practice and work to reveal that nature within each one of us. And so, um, yeah, I mean, I think for my work, ultimately, I really aspire to help myself and others, yeah, see into their own awakened, radiant nature.
Mm. Well, it has been an illuminating experience, and I'm so grateful for the way that you shine in the work that you do and in this conversation. And I am looking forward to continuing to be in dialogue with you, in relationship with you as fellow writers and mothers and people committed to doing this work, this integrated work. So thank you so much, Adriana.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren, for having me. It's really such a joy to be connected, and it's also just really heartening to meet other moms and writers that are doing this work from their own, vantage points and spiritual traditions. I think it's desperately needed. So thank you.